The stagecoach's wheels ground to a halt, kicking up a final plume of dust that hung in the amber light of the setting sun as Lillian Kent clutched her valise with trembling hands. The driver's grim face told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words that would leave her stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from Paso Robles, California. "Miss Kent, I'm afraid this is as far as we go today," the driver announced, his weathered face drawn with concern as he gestured toward the broken wheel. "Axles split clean through. No way to repair it out here before nightfall." Lillian stepped down from the coach, her burgundy traveling dress already coated with the fine California dust that seemed to permeate everything in the summer of 1878. At 22, she had never faced such a predicament alone on the edge of civilization with the sun rapidly disappearing behind the rolling hills. "But surely you can't mean to leave me here," Lillian protested, glancing nervously at the other passengers who were already collecting their belongings. "I have an appointment in Paso Robles tomorrow that I simply cannot miss." The driver shook his head apologetically as he handed down her second bag. "The nearest station is 3 miles back. Most folks are heading that way to wait for the replacement coach tomorrow." He pointed to the small group of passengers already starting the walk back down the rutted road. "You best join them before it gets dark, miss." Lillian's heart sank as she calculated what this delay would mean. Her meeting with the attorney handling her late father's estate was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning. If she missed it, she might lose her only chance to secure the inheritance that would save her from destitution. "How far to Paso Robles from here?" she asked, squinting toward the horizon where she could see nothing but rolling hills and scattered oak trees. 7 miles at least," the driver replied with a sympathetic frown. "Too far to walk before dark, especially for a lady alone. These hills aren't safe after sundown coyotes, mountain lions, and worse." The other passengers were already a good distance down the road, their figures growing smaller with each passing moment. Lillian hesitated, torn between following them back to the station and somehow pushing forward to her destination. As the driver climbed up to retrieve the mail pouch, the sound of hoofbeats drew Lillian's attention to the crest of the hill ahead. A lone rider appeared against the fiery backdrop of the setting sun, his silhouette growing larger as he approached at a steady canter. The horseman reined in his mount several yards from the disabled stagecoach. He sat tall in the saddle, his face shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat. The man's shoulders were broad beneath a worn leather vest, his legs long in the stirrups of a well-used saddle. "Trouble with the coach." His voice carried easily across the distance, deep and unhurried. "Busted axle," the driver called back, taking the passengers back to Wilson Station for the night. The rider's gaze shifted to Lillian, who stood alone beside her luggage while the last of the other travelers disappeared around a bend in the road. He nudged his horse forward, and as he came closer, Lillian could see his face tanned and weathered, with eyes the color of a clear winter sky. He couldn't have been more than 30, though the lines at the corners of his eyes suggested he'd spent most of those years under the harsh western sun. "You heading back with them, madam?" he asked, tipping his hat slightly. Lillian straightened her shoulders, unwilling to appear as vulnerable as she felt. "I need to reach Paso Robles by morning. It's a matter of considerable importance." The man studied her for a moment, then glanced at the sinking sun. "You won't make it on foot before dark, and these hills aren't kind to nighttime travelers." "So I've been told," Lillian replied, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. He approached and stood before her, respectfully removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Zachary Thornton," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Ranch owner about 4 miles north of Paso Robles." "Lillian Kent," she replied, offering her gloved hand, which he took briefly. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Kent." His eyes traveled to her luggage and back to her face. "You seem determined to reach town tonight." "I am," she confirmed. "I have business that cannot wait." Zachary Thornton replaced his hat and glanced at the stagecoach driver, who was securing the mail to take with him back to the station. Then he turned back to Lillian with a decisive nod. "My horse carries too," he said simply, gesturing to the sturdy chestnut gelding that stood patiently nearby. "I can take you to Paso Robles before full dark if we leave now." Lillian hesitated, weighing her limited options. Her father had raised her to be cautious around strangers, especially men, but there was something in Zachary Thornton's direct gaze that inspired trust. "That's very kind, Mr. Thornton, but I couldn't impose no imposition," he interrupted gently. "I'm headed that way myself. Wouldn't be right to leave a lady stranded at Sundown." The driver called over. "Mr. Thornton's good people, Miss Kent. Known him for years." "If he's offering you a ride, I'd take it." Lillian took a deep breath. "Very well, Mr. Thornton. I accept your offer with gratitude." His face softened into a slight smile. "Just Zach, if you don't mind. Only the bank manager and the tax collector call me Mr. Thornton." He picked up her larger bag with ease, securing it behind the saddle with practiced movements. The smaller valise he tied to the opposite side, balancing the load. Then he turned to her, hands clasped before him. "Ever ride double before, Miss Kent?" Lillian shook her head. "I'm afraid not." "It's simple enough. I'll mount first, then help you up behind me." He swung into the saddle with the grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, then extended his hand down to her. Lillian gathered her skirts as modestly as possible and placed her hand in his. With surprising strength, he lifted her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. "You'll want to hold on," he instructed, his voice matter of fact. "Around my waist is best. These hills can be steep in places." Reluctantly, Lillian placed her hands lightly at his sides, trying to maintain as much propriety as the situation allowed. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, though she felt anything but. With a subtle movement and soft click of his tongue, Zachary urged the horse forward. The animal responded immediately, moving from standstill to a smooth walk without so much as a jolt. "Safe travels," the driver called as they began to ascend the hill. As they crested the rise, Lillian glanced back at the abandoned stagecoach, already looking forlorn in the fading light. The enormity of her situation struck her. Then she was alone in the wilderness with a man she had just met, heading toward a town where she knew no one, to fight for an inheritance she wasn't certain she could claim. The horse increased its pace to a gentle trot, and Lillian found herself instinctively tightening her hold on Zachary's waist. "Don't worry," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying easily back to her. "Rusty's sure-footed, even in poor light. We'll be in Paso Robles before you know it." As they rode in silence for several minutes, the landscape gradually transformed in the deepening twilight. The golden hills took on shades of purple and blue, and the scattered oak trees became dark sentinels against the darkening sky. "May I ask what brings you to Paso Robles, Miss Kent?" Zachary asked, breaking the silence. Lillian hesitated, uncertain how much to share with this stranger. Yet there was something about the vast openness surrounding them that made secrets seem pointless. "My father passed away 3 months ago," she finally said. "He owned property in Paso Robles that I didn't know about until his will was read. I've come to meet with his attorney and settle the estate." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zachary replied, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," she managed. "It's been difficult. My father and I weren't close these past few years, but he was all the family I had." "Family can be complicated out here," he observed. "The West changes people, sometimes in ways their loved ones back east don't understand." His words struck a chord. Her father had left their comfortable Boston home 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of new opportunities in California. His letters had grown increasingly infrequent, until they stopped altogether 2 years ago. The news of his death had come from his attorney, along with the surprising information about property he'd acquired. "Were you born here, Mr. Thornton, I mean, Zach?" she asked, finding it strange to use such familiar address with a man she barely knew. "No," he answered. "Came from Missouri when I was 19. Worked cattle drives for a few years, then as a ranch hand until I saved enough to buy my own spread." "And now you're a landowner," Lillian observed. She felt rather than saw his smile. "On paper, at least." "The bank owns most of it until I make good on my loans. But the land's good, and I've got a decent herd started." The horse navigated down a steep incline, and Lillian instinctively pressed closer to Zachary's back. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, smell the clean scent of soap mingled with leather and horse. It was oddly comforting. "How far now?" she asked as they reached the bottom of the slope and continued along what appeared to be a more established trail. "About 5 miles, he replied. "We'll follow this creek for a while, then cut through Willow Canyon. It's the quickest route to town." The creek gurgled softly beside them, catching the last remnants of daylight on its rippled surface. Above, the first stars had begun to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "It's beautiful," Lillian murmured, almost to herself. "That it is," Zachary agreed. "Different from what you're used to, I imagine." "Very different from Boston," she admitted. "Everything seems so vast here. Untamed. That's what drew your father, I'd wager. Same as most who come west." Lillian considered this. "Perhaps, though I always thought it was the promise of gold that lured him away." Zachary chuckled, the sound resonating through his back against her hands. "Gold fever's claimed many a man. Though these days it's land and cattle that offer the surer fortune." "Is that what you came for? Fortune?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I came for the chance to build something of my own. Back in Missouri, I was the youngest of 5 sons on a farm too small to divide. Out here, a man willing to work hard can make his own way." They rode in companionable silence as the trail narrowed, forcing them to slow their pace. The shadows had deepened considerably, but Zachary seemed to know the path by instinct, guiding the horse confidently through the gathering darkness. "Watch your head," he warned as they entered a stand of trees. Lillian ducked slightly, feeling branches brush against her bonnet. "You know this trail well," she observed. "Used it often enough," he confirmed. "Shorter than the main road, though rougher in spots." As if to emphasize his point, the horse stumbled slightly on loose rocks. Zachary steadied the animal with a gentle pull on the reins and a reassuring word. "You all right back there?" he asked. "Yes," Lillian answered, though her heart had jumped at the momentary loss of balance. Her arms had tightened instinctively around his waist, and she now found herself pressed quite firmly against his back, her cheek almost touching his shoulder. Propriety dictated that she should create more distance between them, but the darkening path and unfamiliar terrain made her reluctant to loosen her hold. Zachary, for his part, seemed untroubled by her proximity. "The stars are magnificent," she said, tilting her head back to look at the clear night sky that was now visible through breaks in the trees. In Boston, the city lights and frequent fog obscured all but the brightest stars, but here they filled the heavens like scattered diamonds. "One of the best things about living out here," Zachary agreed, following her gaze upward for a moment. "Makes a man feel small, but in a good way, puts troubles in perspective." The trail widened as they emerged from the trees, and ahead, Lillian could see the twinkling lights of a settlement in the distance. "Paso Robles," Zachary announced. "We'll be there in 20 minutes or so." A mixture of relief and, surprisingly, disappointment filled Lillian. Their journey had been brief, but there was something about the shared experience that had created an unexpected bond between them. "Where will you stay once we reach town?" he asked. "The attorney recommended Shelton's boarding house," she replied. "Do you know it, Mrs.?" "Shelton runs a respectable place," Zachary confirmed. "Clean rooms, decent food. It's just off the main street, not far from the hot springs." "Hot springs?" Lillian asked, surprised. "That's what Paso Robles is known for. Natural hot springs with healing properties, or so they say. People come from all over to take the waters." "My father never mentioned them in his letters," Lillian mused, "though I suppose there was much he didn't share." The trail joined a more established road, and they could now see other travelers ahead, wagons and riders moving toward the town. Civilization felt suddenly close after their isolated journey through the hills. "May I ask which property you've come to claim?" Zachary inquired as they approached the outskirts of town. "The attorney's letter mentioned something called the Willow Creek Ranch," Lillian replied. "Does that mean anything to you?" Zachary's back stiffened slightly beneath her hands. "Willow Creek, you're certain that's the name?" "Yes," she confirmed, puzzled by his reaction. "Is something wrong with it?" He hesitated before answering. "No, nothing wrong. It's a good piece of land, borders my own ranch to the east. I just didn't realize Jonathan Kent was the owner. He kept to himself mostly." "You knew my father?" Lillian asked, surprised. "Not well," Zachary admitted. "Nodding acquaintances at best. Saw him in town occasionally, exchanged pleasantries at cattle auctions. He wasn't one for socializing." Lillian absorbed this new information about her father, trying to reconcile it with the jovial, outgoing man she remembered from her childhood. The West had indeed changed him, it seemed. They were now entering the town proper, passing scattered houses that gradually gave way to more densely packed buildings. Despite the late hour, the main street was lively with activity saloons with their doors open, spilled light and piano music into the street, while groups of men congregated on wooden sidewalks. Lillian felt conspicuous suddenly, arriving in town on horseback with a strange man as darkness fell. Her grip on Zachary's waist loosened as she became aware of curious glances cast their way. "Shelton's is just ahead," Zachary said, guiding the horse past the busiest section of the street toward a two-story clapboard building set slightly back from the road. A neat sign proclaiming Shelton's boarding house hung beside the front door, and warm light glowed from the windows. He reined in the horse before the small gate that led to the front path and dismounted smoothly. Then he turned and reached up to help Lillian down, his hand strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. For a brief moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the flecks of silver in his beard stubble. He stepped back quickly, releasing her and turning to untie her bags from the saddle. "Thank you for bringing me safely to town," Lillian said, smoothing her rumpled traveling dress. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Zachary handed her the smaller valise and lifted the larger bag himself. "No need for thanks. Couldn't leave a lady stranded." He nodded toward the boarding house. "Let me see you to the door at least." They walked side by side up the short path to the porch, where Zachary set down her bag and cleared his throat awkwardly. "I hope your business with the attorney goes well tomorrow," he said, replacing his hat which he had removed as they approached the house. "Thank you," Lillian replied, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye to this man who had been a stranger just hours before. "And thank you again for your kindness." Before Zachary could respond, the door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with a friendly face. "I thought I heard someone on the porch," she said, her gaze moving curiously between Lillian and Zachary. "Can I help you, Mrs. Shelton, I presume?" Lillian asked. "I'm Lillian Kent. I believe my father's attorney, Mr. Hargrove, arranged accommodations for me." Recognition lit the woman's face. "Oh yes, Miss Kent, we've been expecting you. The stagecoach was due hours ago. We were growing concerned." "There was an accident with the coach," Lillian explained. "Mr. Thornton was kind enough to bring me to town, Mrs." Shelton's eyes widened slightly as she registered Zachary's presence. "Well, that was fortunate indeed. Please come in, Miss Kent. Your room is ready, and I can have a hot meal brought up if you're hungry after your journey." Lillian turned to Zachary. "Would you care to join me for supper, Mr. Thornton? It seems the least I can offer in return for your assistance." A fleeting expression crossed his face, surprise, perhaps, or something more complex. "Thank you, but I should get back to my ranch. Things to attend to before morning." "Of course," Lillian said, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be in town tomorrow afternoon delivering some horses to the livery. Perhaps we might speak then if you've time. I could tell you what I know of Willow Creek Ranch." Hope rose unexpectedly in Lillian's chest. "I'd appreciate that very much. Shall we say 3 o'clock at the cafe next to the general store?" 3 o'clock, she agreed with a smile. Zachary tipped his hat to both women. "Ladies," he said in farewell, then turned and walked back to his waiting horse. Lillian watched as he mounted and guided the animal back toward the main street, his straight-backed silhouette gradually disappearing into the evening shadows. "Well now, Mrs." Shelton said with gentle amusement as she ushered Lillian inside. "It seems you've had quite the adventure already, Miss Kent, and made a friend in Zachary Thornton, no less. That's not something that happens every day." "Oh," Lillian asked, curious despite her fatigue. "Is he not well liked in town?" Mrs. Shelton closed the door behind them and picked up Lillian's larger bag with surprising strength for a woman of her age. "Quite the contrary. Zach's respected by everyone who knows him. He's just particular about his company. Keeps to himself mostly, focused on building that ranch of his." She led the way up a narrow staircase, which is why it's interesting to see him offering rides to young ladies and making appointments for coffee. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. He was simply being kind to a stranded traveler, nothing more. Mrs. Shelton's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she merely said, "Your room is this way, dear. Let's get you settled and then I'll bring up some supper. You must be exhausted after such a day." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small writing desk beneath the window. It felt luxurious to Lillian after the long journey from Boston, with its succession of trains, stagecoaches, and finally, the unexpected horseback ride. After Mrs. Shelton left to fetch supper, Lillian moved to the window and looked out at the now dark town. Somewhere out there, Zachary Thornton was making his way back to his ranch, perhaps already forgetting their brief encounter while she found herself unable to stop thinking about him. She shook her head at her own foolishness. She had come to Paso Robles for one purpose, to claim her inheritance and decide what to do with it. Romantic notions about rugged ranchers had no place in her plans. Yet as she turned away from the window, Lillian found herself looking forward to 3 o'clock the next day with an eagerness that had nothing to do with learning about Willow Creek Ranch. The morning dawned clear and warm, with sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Lillian's room at the boarding house. She had slept surprisingly well despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the anticipation of her meeting with Mr. Hargrove, her father's attorney. After a hearty breakfast provided by Mrs. Shelton, Lillian dressed in her best traveling suit, a deep blue ensemble with modest bustle and matching jacket that had served her well during important business in Boston. Her father had always insisted that proper attire commanded respect, especially when dealing with matters of business and property. The law offices of Hargrove and Sons were located on the second floor of a brick building that also housed the town bank. A bell chimed softly as Lillian entered the small waiting area precisely at 10 o'clock. A young clerk looked up from his desk. "May I help you, madam? I'm Lillian Kent. I have an appointment with Mr. Hargrove regarding my father's estate." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly in recognition. "Yes, Miss Kent. Mr. Hargrove is expecting you. Please follow me." He led her through a door into a larger office where a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers rose from behind a substantial desk. "Miss Kent, welcome to Paso Robles," he said, coming around to shake her hand. "I'm Elias Hargrove. Please accept my condolences on your father's passing. He was a good man." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Lillian replied, taking the offered chair. "I appreciate your assistance in this matter." Of course," the attorney said, returning to his seat. "I served as your father's legal counsel for nearly 5 years. I was honored that he trusted me with his final affairs." He opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. "Now, I presume you've traveled all this way to discuss the property he left to you?" "Yes," Lillian confirmed. "Your letter mentioned Willow Creek Ranch, but provided few details. I confess I knew nothing of my father owning ranch land here." Hargrove nodded sympathetically. "Jonathan was a private man, especially about his business dealings. He acquired Willow Creek about 3 years ago when the previous owner found himself in financial difficulties." He extracted a map from the folder and spread it on the desk, turning it so Lillian could see. "Here," he said, pointing to a substantial parcel outlined in red. "Approximately 600 acres with Willow Creek running through the eastern portion. Good grazing land, some timber on the northern section. The ranch house is here, near the creek." Lillian studied the map, trying to make sense of the boundaries and landmarks. "Is it valuable?" she asked hesitantly. "Quite," Hargrove confirmed. "Land values in this region have increased steadily over the past decade. The water rights alone make it desirable, not to mention the improvements your father made to the property." "Improvements?" "Yes, he invested considerably in fencing, a new barn, expanded corrals. The house itself is modest but solid, 3 bedrooms, a good kitchen. Nothing fancy but comfortable." Lillian's mind raced with this new information. Her father had created a life here that she knew nothing about, building something substantial while maintaining his distance from his only child. "Are there livestock?" she asked, uncertain of the proper questions to ask about ranch property. "A small herd of cattle, about 50 head, Hargrove replied. "And some horses, 7 or 8, I believe. Your father employed a ranch hand, Miguel Sanchez, who has been maintaining the property since Jonathan's passing. A trustworthy man who's been paid from the estate funds as we awaited your arrival." "I see," Lillian said, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility suddenly placed upon her shoulders. "And what are my options regarding the property?" Hargrove leaned back in his chair. "Well, as the sole heir, you have several choices. You could sell outright. There would be interested buyers, I assure you. You could retain ownership but hire a manager to run it while you return east. Or, he paused, you could take possession and live there yourself, though I understand that might not be practical for a young lady of your background. The thought of returning to Boston with money from the sale of the ranch crossed Lillian's mind. She could resume her life there, perhaps open the small bookshop she had always dreamed of, yet something held her back from immediately choosing that path. I think I should at least see the property before making any decisions, she said finally. Is that possible? Of course, Hargrove agreed. In fact, I took the liberty of asking Miguel to bring a wagon into town this afternoon. He can take you out to the ranch whenever you're ready. This afternoon, Lillian repeated, remembering her arrangement to meet Zachary at 3. Would tomorrow morning be possible instead? I have a prior commitment. If Hargrove was surprised by her request, he didn't show it. Certainly, I'll send word to Miguel. Shall we say 9 o'clock tomorrow? He can collect you at the boarding house. That would be perfect, Lillian agreed. In the meantime, could you tell me more about my father's time here? I'm afraid we were estranged these past few years. A shadow of something discomfort perhaps crossed Hargrove's face briefly. Jonathan kept largely to himself, as I mentioned. He was respected in business matters, always fair in his dealings. He spent most of his time at the ranch, came to town only when necessary. Did he have friends here? Lillian pressed, hungry for any details about her father's life. Acquaintances, certainly, Hargrove replied carefully. Business associates. He was not one for social gatherings or church functions. I believe he found his peace in the solitude of Willow Creek. Something in the attorney's measured words suggested there was more to the story, but Lillian sensed he would not elaborate further. She would need to find other sources to learn about her father's life in Paso Robles. They spent the next hour reviewing legal documents that transferred ownership of the property and its contents to Lillian. Hargrove explained the tax obligations and provided an accounting of the modest funds held in the local bank under her father's name. By the time she left the law office, Lillian's head was swimming with information, and her feelings about her inheritance remained confused. Part of her resented that her father had built this new life without her, while another part was curious about what had drawn him to this place and this property. She spent the remainder of the morning exploring the town, finding it smaller but more prosperous than she had expected. The natural hot springs that Zachary had mentioned were housed in an impressive bathhouse at the edge of town, surrounded by manicured gardens. The main street boasted several stores, a hotel, a church, and the expected assortment of saloons and eateries. At 2:30, Lillian returned to the boarding house to freshen up before her meeting with Zachary. She found herself taking more care with her appearance than was strictly necessary, pinning her honey-colored hair more carefully, and changing into a simpler but flattering sage green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. "Going somewhere special, Mrs.?" Shelton asked with a knowing smile when Lillian came downstairs. "Just meeting Mr. Thornton for coffee," Lillian replied, aiming for a casual tone. "He offered to tell me about Willow Creek Ranch." "Did he now?" Mrs. Shelton's eyes twinkled. "Well, you couldn't ask for a better guide to local matters. Zach knows every inch of this valley." The cafe next to the general store was a pleasant establishment with checkered tablecloths and large windows that let in the afternoon light. Lillian arrived precisely at 3 o'clock to find Zachary already seated at a corner table, rising as she approached. He looked different in the daylight, still rugged, but more polished. He had shaved, and his dark hair was neatly combed. He wore a clean shirt under a brown leather vest, and though his clothes were simple, they suited his tall, lean frame perfectly. "Miss Kent," he greeted her, pulling out a chair. "I'm glad you could make it. Please call me Lillian, she said as she took the offered seat. After sharing a horse, I think we can dispense with formalities. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Lillian it is, then. A waitress approached, and they both ordered coffee. When she had gone, Lillian turned her attention back to Zachary. I met with Mr. Hargrove this morning, she began. He showed me where Willow Creek is located on a map, but I confess I still have little concept of what my father's property is actually like. Zachary nodded. It's good land. The creek provides reliable water even in dry years, and the mix of pasture and oak woodland makes for excellent grazing. Your father made smart improvements to the place. You sound like you know it well, Lillian observed. As I mentioned yesterday, my ranch borders Willow Creek to the east. We share about 2 miles of fence line. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. In fact, I approached your father about purchasing some of his land last year. This caught Lillian by surprise. You wanted to buy part of Willow Creek, the northern section, Zachary confirmed. About 100 acres that would give my cattle better access to water during summer months. I offered a fair price, but he wasn't interested in selling. The waitress returned with their coffee, providing a moment for Lillian to process this information. When they were alone again, she asked, "Are you still interested in that land, Mr. Thornton?" He met her eyes directly. "I am. But that's not why I offered you a ride yesterday or why I suggested meeting today. I want to be clear about that." Lillian believed him. There was an honesty in his gaze that was impossible to doubt. "I appreciate your candor," she said. "And please, it's Zach, isn't it? As you're calling me Lillian." He smiled then, a full smile that transformed his serious face and revealed a small dimple in his right cheek. "It is." "Well, Zach, I'm going to visit Willow Creek tomorrow morning. Mr. Hargrove has arranged for the ranch hand Miguel, I believe, to take me there. I haven't decided what I'll do with the property yet." "Have you ever lived outside a city?" Zach asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. "No," Lillian admitted. "I've spent my entire life in Boston, except for summers at my grandmother's home in Vermont when I was a child. Ranch life is different," he said simply. "Beautiful but demanding, isolated at times, not for everyone." "Are you suggesting I wouldn't be capable of managing it?" Lillian asked, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice. Zach shook his head. "Not at all. Plenty of women run successful ranches. It's just not a decision to make lightly, especially if you're used to city conveniences." Lillian sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I suppose selling would be the sensible choice. I could return to Boston with the proceeds, establish myself there." For some reason, saying the words aloud felt hollow, as if the life she was describing belonged to someone else. In the short time since arriving in Paso Robles, something about this place had begun to work its way under her skin. "Is that what you want?" Zach asked, watching her closely. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "A week ago I would have said yes without hesitation, but now—" She gestured vaguely toward the window and the town beyond. "There's something about this place. I feel as if I might understand why my father chose to stay here." Zach nodded, as if her answer didn't surprise him. "The West has a way of calling to certain people. Your father heard it. Maybe you do too." They fell into comfortable conversation after that, with Zach telling her more about the area, the seasonal rhythms of ranch work, the tight-knit community that existed beneath the rugged exterior, the challenges and rewards of the life he'd chosen. Lillian found herself sharing stories from her own life in Boston, her work as a teacher at a girls' school, her love of literature, her dreams of someday opening a bookshop. She didn't mention the financial difficulties that had plagued her since her father stopped sending funds 2 years earlier, or how close she had come to accepting a marriage proposal from a man she didn't love, simply for the security it would provide. As their coffee cups emptied and the afternoon light began to soften, Lillian realized they had been talking for nearly 2 hours. She couldn't remember the last time she had enjoyed a conversation so much or felt so at ease with someone she had just met. "I should probably return to the boarding house," she said reluctantly. "Mrs. Shelton mentioned dinner is served promptly at 6. "Of course," Zach agreed, signaling for the bill. When it came, he insisted on paying despite Lillian's protests. "You can buy the coffee next time," he said, then looked slightly embarrassed at the presumption that there would be a next time. "I'd like that," Lillian said softly. They walked together along the wooden sidewalk, the late afternoon bustle of the town swirling around them. When they reached the turning that led to the boarding house, Zach stopped. "I have some business to finish at the livery," he explained. "But I was wondering, would you mind if I rode out to Willow Creek tomorrow while you're there? I could show you some of the boundary lines, maybe point out things Miguel might not think to mention." Lillian felt a flutter of pleasure at the suggestion. "I'd welcome your company, Zach, thank you." "I'll see you there then," he said with a slight bow. "Around 10. "I look forward to it," she replied, meaning it more than she cared to admit. As she watched him walk away, his confident stride carrying him through the crowd with ease, Lillian wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. She had come to Paso Robles expecting nothing more than a brief business transaction before returning east. Instead, she found herself contemplating a future in this dusty, beautiful place and increasingly curious about the man who had rescued her from a stranded stagecoach at sundown. The next morning dawned with a layer of fog that clung to the hills surrounding Paso Robles, promising a cooler day than the one before. Lillian dressed practically in a simple skirt and shirtwaist, with sturdy boots that she was grateful to have packed for the journey west. Miguel Sanchez arrived at the boarding house promptly at 9, driving a well-maintained wagon pulled by 2 matched bay horses. He was a man of middle years with a weathered face and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled in greeting. "Buenos dias, Señorita Kent," he said, helping her up onto the wagon seat. "I am pleased to finally meet Jonathan's daughter." "Thank you for maintaining the ranch in my father's absence, Mr. Sanchez," Lillian replied as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Miguel, please," he corrected gently. "And it has been my honor. Your father was a good man, a fair employer." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled away from the boarding house, heading west out of town. As they traveled, Miguel pointed out landmarks and shared information about the surrounding ranches and farms. His English was excellent, though flavored with the musical cadence of his native Spanish. "How long did you work for my father?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious about this man who had known her father in his final years. "Almost 3 years," Miguel replied. "I came north from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desire to make a better life. Your father gave me a chance when others would not." "That doesn't sound like the man I remember," Lillian murmured, more to herself than to Miguel. He glanced at her curiously. "People change, Señorita. The Jonathan Kent I knew was a quiet man, yes, sometimes melancholy, but he had a good heart." "Melancholy," Lillian echoed. "Was he unhappy here?" Miguel considered this as the wagon rolled over a small wooden bridge spanning a narrow creek. "Not unhappy exactly, more haunted perhaps, as if he carried a great sadness." He looked at her directly. "He spoke of you sometimes, always with pride." Lillian felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "He never wrote about his life here," she said. "His letters became infrequent, then stopped altogether. I thought he had simply forgotten about me." "No, Señorita," Miguel said firmly. "He kept your photograph on his desk." "The one of you in the blue dress at your graduation, yes. He would look at it often." The photograph Miguel described had been taken 5 years ago, just before her father left for California. It had been a happy day, her graduation from the Boston Female Academy, her future bright with possibilities. How had that picture found its way to a remote ranch in California? And why had her father cherished it while maintaining his distance? The wagon crested a hill, and Miguel pointed ahead. There, Señorita. Willow Creek Ranch. The fog had burned off, revealing a valley that stretched before them, green and gold in the morning light. A cluster of buildings nestled near a line of tall willow trees that marked the course of a creek. Fields stretched in all directions, dotted with cattle grazing peacefully. In the distance, hills rose, covered with scattered oak trees that cast pools of shadow on the golden grass. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, understanding suddenly why her father might have chosen this place. "It is," Miguel agreed with quiet pride. "Your father loved this land." They followed a rutted road down into the valley, passing through an open gate with a simple wooden sign that read Willow Creek Ranch. As they approached the buildings, Lillian could make out a modest but well-maintained house with a wide porch, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings and corrals where horses moved about. Miguel reined in the wagon before the house. "Welcome home, Señorita Kent." The simple phrase sent an unexpected jolt through Lillian. Home. Was this place, this ranch she had never seen before yesterday, truly her home now? Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Turning, she saw Zachary approaching on the chestnut gelding she remembered from their first meeting. He rode with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and the sight of him stirred something in her that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Right on time," she said with a smile as he dismounted and secured his horse to a hitching post. "A man's word is his bond out here," Zach replied, touching his hat in greeting before nodding to Miguel. "Buenos dias, Miguel. ¿Cómo estás?" "Bien, Señor Thornton, gracias," Miguel replied, a hint of surprise in his expression as he glanced between Zach and Lillian. "You two are acquainted. Mr. Thornton kindly rescued me when the stagecoach broke down," Lillian explained. "He's offered to show me the property boundaries today." Miguel nodded, though Lillian detected a flicker of something concern, perhaps, or caution in his eyes. "I see. Then I will prepare some coffee while you show the señorita around, Señor Thornton." As Miguel led the wagon horses toward the barn, Zach turned to Lillian. "Would you like to see the house first, or tour the property?" "The house, I think," Lillian decided. "I'm curious about where my father lived." Zach nodded and walked with her to the porch steps. "I've only been inside once or twice when your father invited me to discuss boundary issues." The front door opened onto a small but comfortable parlor with simple, sturdy furniture. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while bookshelves lined another. Lillian was surprised by the number of volumes. Her father had always been a reader, but she hadn't expected him to transport his library to California. Moving through the house, she found it clean and well-maintained, if somewhat sparse in decoration. The kitchen was large and practical, with a cast-iron stove and a table that could seat 6 comfortably. A hallway led to 3 bedrooms, one clearly her father's, with a desk positioned to look out over the valley, and 2 smaller rooms that appeared unused. On the desk, just as Miguel had described, stood a framed photograph of Lillian in her graduation dress. Beside it lay a leather-bound book that she recognized as her father's journal. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. "I'll give you some privacy," Zach said quietly from the doorway, sensing the emotional moment. "No, please stay," Lillian replied, surprising herself with the request. I'd rather not be alone just now." He nodded and remained in the doorway while she opened the journal to its final entries. Her father's familiar handwriting filled the pages, and tears blurred her vision as she began to read. April 12, 1878, the doctor from San Luis Obispo confirmed today what I have suspected for months. The pain in my chest is not merely indigestion, as I've been telling myself, but a weakening of my heart. He gives me perhaps 6 months, a year at most if I avoid exertion and emotional distress. A tall order for a rancher. I have written to Hargrove to update my will. Everything must go to Lillian, of course. My beautiful, intelligent daughter, whom I have failed so completely. Will she ever forgive my absence? Will she ever understand that I left not because I didn't love her, but because I couldn't bear to stay and watch her mother in another man's arms? Pride is a terrible sin. It kept me from explaining, from reaching out when the initial anger cooled. And now it may be too late. I will write to her tomorrow. I will explain everything, beg her forgiveness, invite her to visit Willow Creek. Perhaps if God grants me enough time, I might see her once more before the end. Lillian's hands shook as she turned to the next page, but it was blank. The letter her father had intended to write had never been sent. Instead, barely a month after that final entry, Jonathan Kent had been found dead at his desk by Miguel, the victim of a massive heart attack. He was going to explain, she whispered, more to herself than to Zach. He was going to tell me why he left. Zach moved from the doorway to stand beside her, close enough to offer support but not so close as to intrude on her grief. Sometimes men find it harder to say the important things, he said quietly, especially to those they love most. Lillian closed the journal gently and placed it back on the desk. He mentioned my mother being in another man's arms. I don't understand. My mother died when I was 12. There was never another man. Confusion creased Zach's brow. Your father spoke of your mother as if she were alive. He mentioned once that she had remarried, that it had been difficult for him. Lillian shook her head firmly. That's impossible. My mother died of influenza in 1868. I nursed her myself through her final days. Could there have been another woman? Someone he referred to as your mother out of habit, perhaps? No, he never remarried. It was always just the two of us until he left for California. Lillian frowned, trying to make sense of the discrepancy. Unless... A memory surfaced, her father in close conversation with her Aunt Margaret, her mother's younger sister who had come to live with them after her mother's death. Margaret, who had been like a second mother to Lillian, who had eventually married and moved to New York while Lillian was away at school. Could he have meant my aunt? She wondered aloud. But that doesn't make sense either. She married Uncle Henry while I was at school. Father gave them his blessing. Zach offered no answer, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of her musings. After a moment of silence, he suggested gently, "Perhaps we should continue the tour. Miguel will have coffee ready by now." Lillian nodded, grateful for the change of subject. She needed time to process what she had read, to reconcile this new image of her father with the one she had carried for years. They found Miguel in the kitchen, where he had laid out coffee and some freshly baked bread with honey. After the simple refreshment, the three of them set out to tour the property, Lillian and Zach on horseback, with Miguel following in the wagon to check on more distant parts of the ranch. Zach had brought a gentle mare for Lillian to ride, and though it had been years since her riding lessons in Boston, she found the rhythm came back naturally. They rode side by side through pastures where cattle grazed, past a small apple orchard that Miguel said had been her father's pet project, and along the willow-lined creek that gave the ranch its name. "Your property extends to those hills," Zach explained, pointing to the north where oak-studded slopes rose against the sky. Good timber up there, mostly for ranch use fence posts, firewood, repair work. And where does your land begin? Lillian asked. Zach gestured to the east, where a line of fence posts stretched toward distant hills. That fence marks the boundary. My ranch, the Broken T, lies beyond. The Broken T, my brand, he explained with a slight smile. A T with a break in the horizontal line. Seemed fitting when I started with broken-down buildings and barely enough money to survive the first winter. And now? Lillian asked, curious about his circumstances. Better, he acknowledged. Still mortgaged to the bank, but the herd's growing and last year's cattle prices were good. Another year or two, and I might actually turn a profit. There was no self-pity in his tone, just matter-of-fact assessment and quiet determination. Lillian found herself admiring his resilience, his willingness to work toward a distant goal through years of struggle. They stopped on a rise that offered a panoramic view of both ranches. To the west, Willow Creek spread before them, lush and well-tended. To the east, Zach's Broken T showed similar care, though perhaps with fewer improvements. The contrast wasn't stark, but it was clear that her father had had more capital to invest in his property. This is where our boundaries meet, Zach said, dismounting and walking to a fence post that marked a corner where the property line changed direction. The land I was interested in buying begins here and extends north to include that stand of oaks and the seasonal creek beyond. Lillian slid from her saddle, glad to stretch her legs. Why is that particular section important to you? Water, he replied simply. That creek flows even in late summer, when mine runs dry. Having access to it would mean I wouldn't have to drive my cattle as far to drink during the dry season. He pointed to a distant line of trees. That's the creek I have access to now. It's reliable in winter and spring, but by August, it's often just a string of muddy pools. Hard on the cattle, hard on the land around it from overuse. Lillian could see the logic in his request. She studied the land in question, a relatively small section of her property, but clearly valuable to Zach's operation. What would you do with it if you owned it? She asked. Fence it properly. Develop the water source with a couple of stock tanks to prevent erosion around the creek banks. Maybe plant some shade trees for the cattle. His plans were practical, focused on sustainable use rather than exploitation. It impressed her, as did his obvious knowledge of land management. I'll consider it, she said finally, once I decide what to do with Willow Creek as a whole. Zach nodded, accepting her answer without pushing for more. It's a big decision. You should take your time. They remounted and continued their exploration, with Zach pointing out features of the land and answering Lillian's many questions about ranch operation. By the time they returned to the house for a late lunch prepared by Miguel, Lillian had a much clearer understanding of what her inheritance entailed, both its value and the responsibility it represented. Over lunch, the conversation turned to the challenges of the coming season. Miguel mentioned that several neighboring ranches had reported cattle missing, suggesting rustlers might be operating in the area. Sheriff's been notified, Zach said, but he's stretched thin. Most ranches are increasing their night patrols. Is Willow Creek at risk? Lillian asked, concern creasing her brow. Every ranch with good stock is at risk, Miguel replied, but we have been fortunate so far. I have been sleeping in the bunkhouse with Roberto and Carlos, taking turns keeping watch. Lillian hadn't realized there were other workers on the property, though it made sense given its size. How many people are employed here? She asked. Just the three of us full-time, Miguel explained. We hire additional help during roundup and branding season. And is that sufficient? Lillian had no concept of what proper staffing for a ranch should be. Your father ran a tight operation, Zach said. Miguel's a skilled foreman, and from what I've seen, he manages the place efficiently. Miguel nodded in acknowledgement of the compliment. We could use another hand during busy seasons, but we manage well enough. Lillian found herself thinking practically about the ranch's operation, considering budgets, staffing needs, potential improvements. It surprised her how naturally these considerations came, as if some part of her had been preparing for this responsibility without her conscious awareness. After lunch, Miguel excused himself to attend to afternoon chores, leaving Lillian and Zach alone on the porch overlooking the valley. The day had warmed considerably, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sun-baked grass and distant wildflowers. "It's so peaceful," Lillian observed, settling into a wooden rocking chair that had clearly been her father's favorite seat, judging by its worn arms and the small table positioned beside it to hold his pipe and tobacco pouch. "It can be," Zach agreed, leaning against the porch railing. "Other times it's backbreaking work from sunrise to sunset, calving season, roundup, drought years when you're hauling water and praying for rain. Those aren't so peaceful." "Yet you chose this life," Lillian said, studying his profile as he gazed out over the land. "I did," he acknowledged with a small smile. "Wouldn't trade it, hard as it gets sometimes. There's something about building something with your own hands, watching it grow, knowing it might outlast you. It satisfies something deep inside." His words resonated with Lillian, touching on feelings she hadn't fully articulated even to herself: the desire to create something lasting, to leave her mark on the world in some tangible way. "I always thought I'd open a bookshop," she confessed. "A small place in Boston where people could gather, discuss ideas, discover new worlds through reading. It seemed like a worthy ambition." "It is," Zach said, turning to face her. "Books matter. Ideas matter." But he shrugged. "No, but a person can build more than one kind of legacy. Your father created this ranch, but he also kept all those books inside. Both mattered to him, I'd wager." Lillian considered this, thinking of the well-stocked bookshelves she'd seen in her father's house. Perhaps there was wisdom in Zach's observation that one didn't have to choose between intellectual pursuits and practical ones, between city life and country living. "What will you do?" Zach asked, after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "About the ranch, I mean." "I honestly don't know," Lillian admitted. "Yesterday, I was certain I would sell it and return to Boston. Today," she gestured toward the valley spread before them, "today I can see why my father stayed." Zach nodded, seeming to understand the conflict she felt. "Whatever you decide, there's no rush. You could stay for a while, get to know the place better before making any permanent decisions." The suggestion appealed to Lillian more than she had expected. The thought of returning immediately to Boston, to the life she had known, suddenly felt like a retreat rather than a return. "Perhaps I will," she said slowly. "Mrs. Shelton mentioned I could stay at the boarding house as long as needed, but—" "You could stay here," Zach suggested, then quickly added, "with Miguel and his wife as chaperones, of course. Teresa lives in town currently, helping her sister with a new baby, but she could return to the ranch if needed." The idea of living in her father's house, sleeping under the roof he had built, walking the land he had loved, it stirred complex emotions in Lillian. Fear, yes, at the unfamiliarity of it all, but also a strange sense of rightness, as if a circle were being completed. "I'll consider it," she said, surprised at her own openness to the possibility. "I should probably return to town soon, though. I promised Mrs. Shelton I'd be back for dinner, and I have some thinking to do." Zach straightened from the railing. "I'll ride with you if you don't mind the company. I need to pick up some supplies from the general store before heading back to my place." "I'd welcome your company," Lillian replied, meaning it more than she cared to admit, As they rode back toward Paso Robles, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail, Lillian found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. In just 2 days, Zachary Thornton had become more than a stranger who had offered her a ride. He had become a guide, an advisor, perhaps even a friend. And something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name, stirred beneath the surface of their interactions. The Stagecoach's breakdown, which had seemed such a disaster at the time, now felt like the hand of fate, or perhaps, Lillian thought with a glance toward the sky, the intervention of a father who had found a way to speak to his daughter one last time. The days that followed brought a flurry of decisions for Lillian. After much consideration and several long conversations with Miguel about the ranch's operation, she decided to stay at Willow Creek temporarily, at least through the summer months. Mrs. Shelton helped her arrange for the delivery of additional clothing and necessities from Boston, while Miguel's wife Teresa returned to the ranch to serve as both housekeeper and companion, ensuring Lillian's reputation remained unblemished. Living at the ranch proved both more challenging and more rewarding than Lillian had anticipated. She rose with the sun each morning, learning the rhythms of country life and gradually taking on small responsibilities around the property. Teresa patiently taught her to cook on the wood-burning stove, while Miguel explained the seasonal cycles of ranch work and introduced her to the basics of animal husbandry. Zachary Thornton became a regular visitor, riding over from the Broken T every few days to check on her progress and offer advice when needed. Their friendship deepened with each encounter, their conversations ranging from practical matters of ranch management to philosophical discussions sparked by books they had both read. On a warm evening in late June, nearly a month after her arrival in California, Lillian sat on the porch with Zach after a day spent helping Miguel's crew move cattle to fresh pasture. Her muscles ached pleasantly from the unaccustomed exercise, and despite the dust that seemed to have worked its way into every fold of her clothing, she felt a deep satisfaction in the day's work. "You're becoming quite the rancher," Zach observed, handing her a cup of coffee from the pot Teresa had left for them. "Miguel says you have a good eye for sick calves." Lillian smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I still have much to learn, but I'm enjoying it more than I expected." She sipped her coffee, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the distant hills with gold. "I received a letter from Boston today. My friend Charlotte thinks I've lost my mind, abandoning civilization for wild frontier life, as she puts it." Zach chuckled. "And what did you tell her?" "That the frontier isn't nearly as wild as she imagines, and that I've found something here I didn't know I was looking for." "And what's that?" Zach asked, his voice softening. Lillian considered the question seriously. "A connection, I suppose, to the land, to my father's legacy. To a way of life that has its own integrity." She glanced at him. "Does that sound foolish?" "Not to me," he replied. "It's why most of us stay, despite the hardships." They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere near the creek, frogs began their nightly chorus. "The Cattlemen's Association is hosting a dance in town this Saturday," Zach said suddenly, "to raise money for the new schoolhouse. I wondered if you might like to attend with me." The invitation hung in the air between them, transforming the easy companionship of the moment into something more significant. Lillian felt her heart quicken. "I'd like that very much," she answered, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Zach's smile was visible even in the gathering darkness. "I'll collect you at 6 then." When Saturday evening arrived, Lillian found herself uncharacteristically nervous as she prepared for the dance. She had brought only practical clothing to California, but Teresa had helped her alter one of her better dresses, a deep rose-colored gown with modest lace trim to conform to the current fashion. "You look beautiful, señorita," Teresa assured her as she arranged Lillian's hair in an elegant style adorned with a few fresh flowers from the garden. "Thank you, Teresa," Lillian replied, studying her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed different from the one who had arrived in Paso Robles a month earlier. Her skin was lightly tanned from days spent outdoors, her eyes brighter, her bearing more confident. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced Zach's arrival. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, Lillian descended to the parlor where Miguel had welcomed their visitor. Zach stood as she entered, and the expression that crossed his face made her heart skip. He was dressed in his finest, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, but it was the look of frank admiration in his eyes that transformed him. "Miss Kent," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed a more personal greeting. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Thornton," she replied, matching his formal tone while sharing his private smile. "You're quite handsome yourself." Miguel cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "The buggy is ready whenever you wish to depart," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Teresa and I will follow in the wagon a bit later." The drive to town was pleasantly companionable, with Zach pointing out constellations as they appeared in the clear night sky and Lillian sharing stories of her first awkward attempts at horseback, riding without a side saddle. "Miguel was very patient," she laughed, "though I think he feared I'd break my neck before mastering the technique." "You're a natural," Zach assured her. "Most city folk take much longer to adjust." The schoolhouse where the dance was being held had been transformed for the occasion with lanterns, bunting, and flowers. A small band played lively tunes on a raised platform at one end of the room, while tables laden with food and punch lined the walls. As they entered, Lillian was conscious of curious glances cast their way. Though she had been in Paso Robles for a month, she had spent most of her time at the ranch, venturing into town only occasionally for supplies or to attend Sunday services. "Everyone's looking at us," she murmured to Zach as he led her toward the punch bowl. "They're looking at you," he corrected with a small smile. "It's not every day Paso Robles sees a beautiful, educated Eastern lady who can also ride and rope like a ranch hand." Before she could respond to the compliment, they were approached by an older couple, the man tall and distinguished with silver at his temples, the woman plump and friendly with lively dark eyes. "Zachary, my boy," the man exclaimed, clapping Zach on the shoulder. "About time you showed your face at a social event." "Judge Parker," Zach greeted him with obvious respect. "Mrs. Parker, may I present Miss Lillian Kent? Lillian, this is Judge William Parker and his wife Martha." The judge handles most legal matters in the county when Mr. Hargrove needs judicial oversight. "Miss Kent," the judge said warmly, taking her hand. "We've heard so much about Jonathan's daughter. Welcome to our little community." "Indeed, Mrs." Parker added, giving Lillian's hand a gentle squeeze. "We're delighted you've decided to stay on at Willow Creek, at least for the summer. Your father was a good neighbor, though rather private. We always hoped he'd participate more in town affairs." "Thank you for your welcome," Lillian replied, touched by their genuine warmth. "I'm still adjusting to ranch life, but everyone has been very kind. Especially Zachary, from what we hear," Mrs. Parker said with a meaningful glance between them. Zach cleared his throat, a hint of color rising in his tanned cheeks. Miss Kent needed some advice about ranch matters. Being neighbors, it seemed the neighborly thing to do. Judge Parker's eyes twinkled with amusement at Zach's discomfort. Of course, merely neighborly. He turned to his wife. Martha, I believe they're playing our song. Shall we demonstrate how it's done before these young people take to the floor? As the Parkers moved away, Zach offered Lillian a cup of punch. His composure recovered. The judge and Mrs. Parker have been like family to me since I arrived in Paso Robles, he explained. They've helped me through some tough times. They seem lovely, Lillian said, sipping the sweet drink, and quite fond of you. They've been trying to see me properly settled for years, Zach admitted with a wry smile. The judge has 3 unmarried nieces in San Francisco that he's particularly keen to introduce me to. I see, Lillian said, surprised by the twinge of jealousy the thought provoked. And have you met these nieces? Once at the Parkers' Christmas dinner 2 years ago, Zach replied. Pleasant girls, all of them, but... He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Before Lillian could inquire further, the first set ended and a new tune began, a lively waltz that set many couples moving toward the dance floor. Would you care to dance, Miss Kent? Zach asked, offering his hand. I'd be delighted, Mr. Thornton, she replied, setting aside her punch cup and allowing him to lead her to the floor. Zach proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her smoothly through the steps with the same confidence he showed on horseback. As they moved together to the music, Lillian felt a heightened awareness of his physical presence, the firm pressure of his hand at her waist, the clean scent of his shaving soap, the warmth in his blue eyes as they met hers. You dance very well for a rancher, she observed, slightly breathless from the pace of the waltz. My mother insisted all her sons learn, he replied. Said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in polite society, regardless of his profession. A wise woman, Lillian said. I'd like to meet her someday. Something flickered in Zach's expression, a brief shadow that was gone almost before she noticed it. She passed away 10 years ago, he said quietly. Influenza epidemic of '68. I'm so sorry, Lillian said, recognizing the shared grief between them. My mother died the same year, of the same illness. The music swelled around them as they continued to waltz, bound now by this unexpected connection, the shared experience of loss at a formative age. It changed everything, Zach said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. My father was never the same afterward. He sold the farm a year later, moved to St. Louis to live with my sister. My brothers scattered, 2 to Oregon, 1 to Texas. I headed west. And never looked back, Lillian asked gently, the corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile. Oh, I looked back plenty, just never found a reason to return. As the waltz ended, Zach led Lillian to a quieter corner of the room where chairs had been arranged for those wishing to rest between dances. They were soon joined by other residents of Paso Robles, eager to meet Jonathan Kent's daughter and hear her impressions of California. Lillian found herself genuinely enjoying the company and conversation. These people had been her father's neighbors, even if he had kept them at a distance, and they welcomed her with an openness that touched her deeply. Throughout the evening, Zach remained attentive, introducing her to key members of the community and ensuring she was never left alone for long. They danced several more times, and with each turn around the floor, Lillian felt the connection between them deepening. By the time Miguel and Teresa arrived to accompany them back to the ranch, the evening was well advanced. The moon hung full and bright above them as they drove home, casting silver light over the sleeping landscape. "Thank you for tonight," Lillian said as they neared Willow Creek Ranch. "I can't remember when I've enjoyed an evening more." "The pleasure was mine," Zach replied. "Though I should warn you, after being seen dancing with me 3 times, you're likely to be the subject of considerable speculation in town." "Only 3 times," Lillian teased. "I counted 4 at least." "Then your reputation is certainly compromised," he said with mock seriousness. "Perhaps I don't mind," she replied softly. The buggy slowed as they approached the ranch house, and behind them, Miguel and Teresa's wagon also reduced speed. The moment of privacy was brief, but charged with unspoken feelings. "Lillian," Zach began, his voice low and serious. Yes," she prompted when he hesitated. He seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "I wondered if you might like to ride out to see the northern section of Willow Creek tomorrow, the part I mentioned being interested in purchasing. If you're going to make decisions about the property, you should see all of it." Though she sensed this wasn't what he had originally intended to say, Lillian nodded. "I'd like that. After church services." "Perfect," he agreed as he guided the buggy to a stop before the house. Miguel and Teresa discreetly busied themselves with the wagon while Zach helped Lillian down from the buggy. As her feet touched the ground, his hands lingered at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Lillian," he said softly. "Thank you for accompanying me this evening." "Good night, Zach," she replied, equally quiet. "Until tomorrow." As she prepared for bed that night, Lillian found herself replaying moments from the evening, the warmth of Zach's hand against hers as they danced, the sound of his laughter at something she'd said, the way his eyes had held hers during a quiet moment between dances. For the first time since arriving in California, Lillian allowed herself to acknowledge what had been growing between them. She was falling in love with Zachary Thornton, his strength, his integrity, his quiet confidence, and the tenderness that lay beneath his reserved exterior. The realization should have frightened her. After all, she had known him barely a month, and her future in California remained uncertain. Yet instead of fear, she felt a sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving were finally falling into place. As sleep claimed her, Lillian's last conscious thought was of Zach's face in the moonlight as he had bid her good night, and the promise of tomorrow's ride together. The next morning dawned clear and warm, promising another beautiful California day. Lillian dressed for church with care, selecting a light blue dress that Teresa assured her was both appropriate for services and suitable for riding afterward. Miguel drove them to town in the wagon, with Teresa chatting happily about the previous night's dance and the latest community news. Lillian found her attention wandering, scanning the streets of Paso Robles as they arrived, searching instinctively for a glimpse of Zach. She spotted him outside the small white church, deep in conversation with Judge Parker. He looked up as their wagon approached, and the smile that lit his face at the sight of her sent a pleasant warmth through Lillian's chest. The service itself was simple but heartfelt, with Reverend Collins delivering a sermon on community and mutual support that seemed particularly relevant to Lillian's growing appreciation of Paso Robles. She found herself genuinely moved by the prayers and hymns shared among neighbors who clearly cared for one another's welfare. Afterward, as the congregation spilled onto the church steps, Lillian was once again surrounded by townspeople eager to welcome her. She answered questions about her impressions of ranch life and her plans for Willow Creek with growing confidence, no longer feeling like an outsider but rather a new member of an established community. "Ready for that ride?" Zach asked when the crowd around her had thinned. He had already changed from his Sunday best into more practical riding clothes, though he still looked handsomer than any man had a right to. "Yes, just let me change as well," Lillian replied. "I'll meet you at the livery in half an hour," Zach nodded. "I'll have the horses saddled and waiting." True to his word, when Lillian arrived at the livery stable having changed into a split riding skirt and sturdy blouse, Zack was waiting with 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding, and a gentle gray mare that he had been letting Lillian use for her riding lessons. "I packed some lunch," he said, indicating the saddlebags. "Thought we might make a day of it if you're not too tired from last night's festivities." "Not at all," Lillian assured him, accepting his help to mount. "I'm looking forward to seeing more of the property." They rode out of town at an easy pace, enjoying the perfect weather and each other's company. As they passed familiar landmarks, Lillian realized how quickly she had come to know this landscape, to appreciate its particular beauty. "It grows on you, doesn't it?" Zack observed, seeming to read her thoughts. "This land. At first it might seem harsh or plain compared to what you knew back east, but then one day you look around and can't imagine being anywhere else." "Yes," Lillian agreed softly. "That's exactly it." They rode in companionable silence for a while, climbing steadily into the hills that marked the northern boundary of Willow Creek Ranch. The terrain grew more rugged, with steeper slopes and denser stands of oak trees creating patterns of sun and shadow on the trail before them. Finally, they crested a ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. Lillian reined in her horse beside Zack's, gazing out over the panorama of their neighboring ranches spreading into the distance. "This is part of the section I mentioned," Zack explained, gesturing to the surrounding hills and the small valley that dipped below them, where a narrow creek meandered between grassy banks. "The water's good year-round, fed by springs higher up. The grazing's decent, too, not as lush as the main valley, but solid forage even in late summer." Lillian studied the land with a more informed eye than she would have possessed a month ago. She could see why this particular section would be valuable to Zack's operation, providing reliable water and additional grazing for his growing herd. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed by the secluded valley. "I had no idea this was part of Willow Creek." "Your father bought it separately, about a year after acquiring the main ranch," Zack explained. "The previous owner was an old prospector who'd given up on finding gold and turned to raising a few cattle instead. When he died, your father purchased it from the estate." They dismounted to rest the horses, finding a shady spot beneath a massive oak tree where they could still enjoy the view. Zack spread a blanket on the grass and began unpacking the lunch he had brought: fresh bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a bottle of cider. "Quite the feast," Lillian observed, settling on the blanket beside him. "Mrs. Shelton packed it," he admitted with a grin. "I mentioned I was taking you on a picnic, and she insisted on providing proper food for a proper outing, as she put it." "A picnic?" Lillian raised an eyebrow teasingly. "I thought this was a business inspection of property boundaries." "Can it be both?" Zack replied, handing her a plate. "Even ranchers are allowed to enjoy themselves occasionally." As they ate, their conversation flowed easily from practical matters of water rights and grazing rotation to more personal subjects. Lillian found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Boston, her years at school, and her dreams of opening a bookshop someday. "You could still do that, you know," Zack said thoughtfully. "Paso Robles doesn't have a proper bookstore, just that small shelf of dime novels and almanacs at Henderson's General Store." "Are you suggesting I open a bookshop here?" Lillian asked, surprised by the idea. "Why not?" "The town's growing. The new schoolhouse will be finished by fall. Seems to me a proper bookstore would do well, especially with someone knowledgeable running it." Lillian considered this, imagining a small shop on Paso Robles Main Street, filled with carefully selected volumes and comfortable chairs where customers could browse. It was an appealing vision, one that combined her love of literature with her growing attachment to this community. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "though I'm not sure I could manage both that and the ranch. Many ranchers have secondary businesses, Zach pointed out. Judge Parker raises cattle but still practices law. Doc Wilson maintains an orchard alongside his medical practice. It's common out here to have multiple interests. The conversation shifted to Zach's own history, his years working cattle drives, the struggles of his early days as a ranch owner, his gradual building of the Broken T into a viable operation. It hasn't been easy, he admitted. There were times, especially that first winter, when I seriously considered giving up and heading back east with my tail between my legs. What stopped you? Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Zach was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the distant hills. Stubbornness, partly, he finally said with a self-deprecating smile. But also, I had this vision of what the place could become. On the worst days, I'd ride up to a spot like this one, look out over the land, and I could see it not as it was then, but as it could be someday. That vision kept me going. There was such conviction in his voice, such quiet passion, that Lillian felt moved by it. This was a man who knew what he wanted and was willing to work tirelessly to achieve it, not for wealth or status, but because he believed in the value of what he was building. Your determination is admirable, she said softly. He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious. What about you, Lillian? What's your vision for your future? The question hung between them, weighted with implications that went beyond mere curiosity. Lillian knew that how she answered might well determine the course of whatever was growing between them. A month ago, I would have said Boston, without hesitation, she replied honestly. My teaching position, perhaps that bookshop someday, a quiet life surrounded by familiar people and places. And now, Zach prompted when she paused. Now, Lillian continued, meeting his gaze steadily, I find myself drawn to a different possibility. This land, this community, they've affected me in ways I never expected. I came here thinking only to settle my father's estate and leave, but instead, I've found something that feels right. The admission felt significant, as if speaking the words aloud had somehow made her shifting desires more concrete. Zach's expression softened, and he reached across the blanket to take her hand. I'm glad to hear it, he said simply, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. The touch was innocent enough, but it sent warmth spreading through Lillian's body. They sat like that for a long moment, hands linked, the connection between them strengthening in the shared silence. Finally, Zach released her hand and began packing away the remains of their picnic. We should start back if we want to reach the ranch before dark, he said, though his reluctance was evident in his tone. The ride home was quieter, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts yet acutely aware of each other's presence. As they approached Willow Creek Ranch, the setting sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Lillian found herself wishing the day could stretch on indefinitely. At the ranch house, Miguel greeted them with news that Sheriff Davis had stopped by with warnings of increased rustling activity in the area. 3 more calves had disappeared from the Henderson place just the previous night. He suggests we double our night patrols, Miguel reported, concern evident in his normally calm demeanor. Roberto and Carlos have already agreed to take shifts, but with our fences covering so much ground. I'll stay and help tonight, Zach offered immediately. My foreman can handle things at the Broken T for a night or two. That's very kind but unnecessary, Lillian began. I insist, Zach interrupted gently. Neighbors look out for each other out here. Besides, if rustlers are working their way through the valley, my place could be next. Better to stop them now. Lillian couldn't argue with his logic, nor did she particularly want to. The thought of Zach remaining at Willow Creek, even if he would be patrolling the property rather than nearby, gave her a sense of security that had nothing to do with cattle rustlers. "Then we accept your help with gratitude," she said formally, before adding with a small smile, "though I expect Teresa will insist you join us for supper before your patrol begins." Indeed, Miguel's wife was already setting an extra place at the table when they entered the house, having anticipated Zach's offer of assistance. The meal was simple but hearty beef stew with fresh bread and apple pie for dessert, and the conversation focused largely on practical matters of protecting the herd and identifying potential weak points in their security. After the meal, Zach prepared to begin his patrol, checking his rifle and accepting a thermos of coffee from Teresa. Lillian walked with him to the porch, reluctant to say goodnight despite the propriety of him leaving to attend to his duties. "Be careful," she said as he mounted his horse. "Rustlers can be dangerous if confronted." "I don't intend to play the hero," he assured her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "If I see anything suspicious, I'll fire a warning shot to alert Miguel and the others. Safety in numbers." "Still," Lillian persisted, genuine concern in her voice, "please don't take unnecessary risks." Zach's expression softened. "I'll be careful, I promise." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I have more reason than ever to return safely." The words hung in the air between them, their meaning clear though unelaborated. Lillian felt her breath catch in her throat. "Good," she managed to say. "Then I'll see you in the morning." "Count on it," he replied, touching his hat in farewell before turning his horse toward the outer pastures. Lillian watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. A strange mixture of emotions swirled within her concern for his safety, warmth at his implied declaration, and a growing certainty that her future lay here in California, not back in Boston. The night passed quietly, with no signs of rustlers or other disturbances. Lillian slept fitfully, waking at the slightest sound outside her window, wondering if Zach was cold or tired as he patrolled the boundaries of her property. Morning brought clear skies and the welcome sight of Zach returning from his night watch, tired but unharmed. He reported no unusual activity, though he had reinforced some weak sections of fencing along the eastern boundary. "I should get back to my own place," he said after accepting a cup of coffee from Teresa. "My foreman will be wondering where I've disappeared to." "Of course," Lillian agreed, though she wished he could stay longer. "Thank you for your help last night. It was a comfort knowing you were watching over things." Something in her tone or expression must have conveyed more than her words, for Zach's eyes warmed noticeably. "I'll always watch over you over Willow Creek. I mean when needed," he said, the slight correction betraying his deeper meaning. He departed with a promise to return in a few days to check on things, leaving Lillian with a curious sense of anticipation, as if they were moving inevitably towards something significant, though neither had spoken of it directly. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Lillian threw herself into learning more about ranch operations, accompanying Miguel on his daily rounds and asking endless questions about cattle management, water resources, and the economics of ranching. In the evenings, she pored over her father's account books, gradually building a picture of Willow Creek's financial standing. Zach visited regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh peaches from a tree on his property, a handcrafted leather bookmark made by a friend in town. Each visit deepened their connection, their conversations ranging from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions about life's purpose and meaning. On a particularly warm afternoon in early July, Lillian was working in her father's study when Teresa announced Zach's arrival. She found him on the porch, looking unusually formal in his good shirt and polished boots, his hat held nervously in his hands. "Zach," she greeted him warmly. "This is a pleasant surprise. I thought you were occupied with branding today." "Finished earlier than expected," he replied, shifting his weight slightly. "I was wondering if you might be free for a ride. There's something I'd like to show you." Intrigued by his somewhat nervous demeanor, Lillian readily agreed. "Of course. Let me change into my riding clothes." When she returned, Zach had already saddled their horses and was waiting patiently in the yard. They set off at an easy pace, heading northeast toward the boundary between their properties. "Where are we going?" Lillian asked as they rode side by side along a well-worn trail. "There's a place on your property, or rather, at the edge of it, that I discovered years ago," Zach explained. "I thought you might like to see it." His mysterious answer only heightened Lillian's curiosity, but she sensed he wasn't ready to say more, so she simply enjoyed the ride and the beauty of the late afternoon landscape. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting a golden light over the rolling hills and turning the dry summer grass into a sea of amber waves. After about 40 minutes of riding, they came to a narrow trail that wound up a steep hillside covered with oak trees. At the top, a flat clearing opened before them, offering a spectacular view of both their ranches spread out below. A small spring bubbled up from between rocks at one edge of the clearing, creating a tiny oasis of greenery in the otherwise dry hillside. "Oh, it's lovely," Lillian breathed as Zach helped her dismount. "Like a secret garden." "I found it by accident my first year here," Zach said, leading the horses to drink from the spring. "I was tracking a stray calf and stumbled upon it just before sunset. I've been coming back ever since when I need a quiet place to think." He spread a blanket beneath the largest oak tree and invited Lillian to sit. From this vantage point, they could see for miles the patchwork of their neighboring ranches, the distant rooftops of Paso Robles, and beyond, the hazy blue mountains that define the horizon. "I can see why you love this spot," Lillian said, drinking in the panoramic view. "It puts everything in perspective, doesn't it?" Zach nodded, settling beside her on the blanket. "That's exactly it. Up here, problems that seem overwhelming down below suddenly appear manageable. Decisions become clearer." There was something in his tone, a note of significance that made Lillian turn to look at him more directly. He met her gaze steadily, his blue eyes serious yet warm with an emotion she was beginning to recognize. "Lillian," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I brought you here because this place has always helped me see things clearly, and I find myself needing that clarity now." Her heart began to beat faster as she sensed the direction of his words. "What things need clarifying, Zach?" She asked softly. He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "When I first met you, when the stagecoach left you stranded at Sundown and I offered you a ride to town, I had no expectation beyond helping a traveler in need. I certainly didn't anticipate." He paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect to find someone who would change the way I see my future." Lillian remained silent, hardly daring to breathe as Zach continued. "These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your courage in facing this new life, your willingness to learn, your kindness to Miguel and Teresa, your intelligence and humor and grace. I've come to care for you deeply, Lillian, more than I thought possible in such a short time." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "I know you came here only to settle your father's estate. I know you had plans to return to Boston, and I would understand completely if that's still your intention. But if there's any chance that you might consider staying not just temporarily, but permanently, I wanted you to know how I feel." Lillian's throat tightened with emotion. This honest, straightforward declaration so like the man himself touched her deeply. "Zach," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I arrived in California, I was certain of my path. I would settle my father's affairs, sell his property, and return to the life I knew. But then," she smiled softly, "then a cowboy said his horse carries two, and everything changed." Hope flickered in Zach's eyes. "Changed how?" he asked cautiously. "I found a connection here that I never expected to this land, to the memory of my father, to the community of Paso Robles." She squeezed his hand gently. "And most of all to you." The tension in Zach's shoulders eased visibly. "Are you saying you might stay?" "I'm saying I want to stay," Lillian clarified. "I've known it for weeks now, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself. This place, this life, it feels right in a way Boston never did, especially now that my father is gone." Zach's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, erasing the worry lines from his brow and lighting his eyes with joy. "Lillian, you've made me the happiest man in California." He hesitated briefly before adding, "There's something else I wanted to ask you, though perhaps it's too soon." "Ask," she encouraged, her heart racing with anticipation. Instead of speaking immediately, Zach reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Opening his palm, he revealed a simple gold ring set with a single modest diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "She gave it to me before she died, said I should save it for the woman who captured my heart completely." His eyes met Lillian's, vulnerable yet certain. "I found that woman in you." Lillian's breath caught as the full meaning of his words and the ring in his palm registered. "Zach, are you?" "Lillian Kent," he said formally, shifting to one knee before her. "I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness welled in Lillian's eyes as the rightness of his proposal resonated through her entire being. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a deep certainty that this man and this life were exactly what she wanted. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Zachary Thornton, I will marry you." Joy transformed Zach's face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her. Then he gathered her into his arms, his embrace gentle yet secure, a promise of the life they would build together. Their first kiss was tender, a sweet acknowledgement of the love that had grown between them since that fateful evening when a broken stagecoach had brought them together. When they finally drew apart, the setting sun had painted the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, nature's own celebration of their engagement. "We should head back," Zach said reluctantly, helping Lillian to her feet. "Miguel and Teresa will be wondering where you've disappeared to." Lillian nodded, though she was reluctant to leave this magical place where their future together had been decided. "We'll come back here often, won't we? To this special spot?" "As often as you like," Zach promised, gathering the blanket and helping her mount her horse. "Perhaps we could even build something here someday, a small cabin, a place to escape when ranch life gets too demanding." The idea appealed to Lillian immensely, a private retreat where they could enjoy the spectacular view and reconnect with each other away from the daily pressures of running their neighboring ranches. As they rode back toward Willow Creek in the gathering twilight, Lillian found herself marveling at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. A broken stagecoach, a kindly cowboy offering assistance, a father's unexpected legacy, all had combined to lead her to a future she could never have imagined just months earlier. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Paso Robles, met with universal approval and a fair amount of good-natured teasing about the speed of their courtship. "Mrs." Shelton claimed credit for predicting the match from the first night. Zach had delivered Lillian to the boarding house, while Judge Parker insisted that he had seen it coming since their first dance at the Cattlemen's Association ball. They set the wedding date for September, allowing time for Lillian to settle her affairs in Boston through correspondence, and for Zach to complete some improvements to the Broken T Ranch house that would make it more suitable for a bride accustomed to Eastern comforts. In the weeks that followed, Lillian made her decision about the northern section of Willow Creek that Zach had been interested in purchasing. Rather than selling it to him outright, she proposed merging their operations after their marriage, maintaining the separate identities of Willow Creek and the Broken T, but managing them as complementary parts of a larger whole. "It makes practical sense," she explained when presenting the idea to Zach. "The northern water source benefits your cattle, while your southern pastures would give my herd more room during calving season. Together, we'd have a more efficient operation than either ranch could achieve alone." Zach was touched by her proposal, recognizing the business acumen behind it, but also the symbolic joining of their separate legacies into something stronger and more enduring. "Practical and romantic at once," he teased, pulling her into his arms. "You continue to surprise me, Lillian Kent." "Soon to be Lillian Thornton," she reminded him with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat. As September approached, Paso Robles bustled with preparations for what promised to be the social event of the season. The small church could barely contain all those who wished to attend, and Mrs. Parker took charge of organizing a reception in the town square where the entire community could celebrate. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, with just enough crispness in the air to herald the coming fall. Lillian prepared in her room at Willow Creek, assisted by Teresa and Mrs. Shelton, who fussed over every detail of her appearance with maternal care. Her wedding dress, ordered from San Francisco, was elegantly simple ivory silk with delicate lace trim that complemented her slender figure without ostentation. Her honey-colored hair was arranged in a sophisticated knot adorned with small white flowers, and around her neck hung a pendant that had belonged to her mother, something old for the occasion. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Shelton declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Your father would be so proud." "Indeed he would," agreed Teresa, making final adjustments to the dress. "Jonathan would be happy to see Willow Creek in such good hands and to see his daughter so clearly in love." Lillian smiled at their sentiments, touched by the mention of her father. In the months since her arrival, she had come to understand him better through the stories shared by Miguel, by occasional references from Zach, and by living on the land he had chosen for his final years. Though questions remained about his life in California, she had found peace with his memory. Miguel served as her escort to the church, a role he accepted with dignified pride. As they drove toward town in the freshly painted wagon decorated with flowers for the occasion, Lillian felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the paths of her life had been leading inevitably to this day and this place. The church was filled to capacity when they arrived, with latecomers standing in the back and even spilling onto the steps outside. As the small organ began to play and Lillian started her walk down the aisle on Miguel's arm, she had eyes only for Zach, who stood waiting for her at the altar. He looked handsome in his new suit, his face freshly shaved and his dark hair neatly combed, but it was the expression in his eyes as he watched her approach that took Lillian's breath away, a mixture of awe, adoration, and absolute certainty that made her own steps more confident. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. Reverend Collins spoke eloquently about the foundation they were building together, not just the joining of two ranches, but the creation of a shared life based on mutual respect, common values, and enduring love. When Zach placed his mother's wedding band beside the engagement ring on Lillian's finger and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, his voice was steady and sure. When Lillian made her own vows in return, she spoke with equal conviction, knowing without doubt that she had found where she belonged. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins declared with evident satisfaction. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Thornton." Zach needed no further encouragement. Drawing Lillian into his arms, he kissed her with a tenderness that conveyed all the love in his heart, sealing their union before God and the community that had become their family. The reception that followed was joyous and lively, with tables set up in the town square under strings of lanterns. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and speeches both touching and humorous from those who had watched their romance blossom. Judge Parker's toast was particularly memorable, recounting how he had spent years trying to match Zach with suitable young ladies, only to have fate accomplish in weeks what his best efforts had failed to achieve over years. "Sometimes," the judge concluded, raising his glass to the newlyweds, "the right person arrives exactly when they're meant to, even if it's from an unexpected direction or a broken-down stagecoach." As the celebration continued into the evening, Lillian and Zach found a quiet moment to slip away to the edge of the square, where they could observe the festivities from a slight distance. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" Zach asked, his arm around her waist drawing her close to his side. "Completely," Lillian assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though it still seems somewhat miraculous, all of this, I mean, that a broken axle and a chance encounter could lead to such happiness." "I don't believe it was chance," Zach said thoughtfully. "Not entirely, at least. I think perhaps your father had a hand in it in his way." Lillian looked up at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Well, consider the timing," Zach explained. "You arrived exactly when the stagecoach line was using that particular route due to repairs on the main road. Your father knew those hills well enough to know that if anything happened to the coach, a traveler would be stranded. And he knew I regularly used that trail when returning from delivering horses to the livery in Paso Robles. You think he somehow arranged for us to meet?" Lillian asked, both skeptical and intrigued by the idea. Zach smiled. "Not directly, of course, but his decision to leave you Willow Creek, knowing you'd have to come claim it in person, maybe that was his final gift to you, and to me, though he couldn't have known that part for certain." The thought warmed Lillian's heart, the possibility that her father, in his final act, had not only provided for her material security, but had also, however indirectly, set in motion the events that would lead to her greatest happiness. "I like to think he knows," she said softly. "That somehow he can see how things turned out." "I believe he does," Zach replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. They rejoined the celebration shortly thereafter, dancing together beneath the stars until the hour grew late and the time came for their departure. The entire town turned out to see them off, showering them with flower petals and good wishes as they climbed into the decorated wagon that would carry them to their new shared life at the Broken T. As they drove away, Lillian looked back at the twinkling lights of Paso Robles growing smaller behind them. She thought of her journey from the uncertain young woman stranded by a broken stagecoach at Sundown to the confident ranch owner and new bride she had become. No regrets. Zach asked quietly, noting her backward glance. Lillian turned to him with a smile that came from the depths of her heart. "Not one," she assured him, taking his hand in hers. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." And as they continued toward home, toward the life they would build together on the land they both loved, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that the broken stagecoach had not left her stranded after all. It had, instead, delivered her precisely where she belonged. 1 year later, the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains of the master bedroom at the Broken T Ranch house, gently waking Lillian from a peaceful sleep. Beside her, Zack still slumbered, his breathing deep, and even one arm draped protectively across her growing belly. Carefully, so as not to disturb him, Lillian eased from the bed and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to watch the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The view never failed to move her, their combined properties stretching toward the horizon, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the promise of another day on the land they had come to nurture together. A year of marriage had brought changes to both their lives. The merger of their ranches had proved even more successful than anticipated, with their combined herds fetching premium prices at the spring cattle auction. The small bookshop Lillian had opened in Paso Robles, stocked with carefully selected volumes ordered from San Francisco and Boston, had quickly become a gathering place for the community, especially after she instituted a weekly reading circle for the town's children. But the greatest change of all was the new life growing within her, their first child, due to arrive in just 2 months. The thought of becoming parents had filled both Lillian and Zack with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, though Teresa's practical advice and Mrs. Parker's maternal wisdom had helped ease their fears. Admiring the sunrise again, Zack's sleep-roughened voice came from the bed behind her. Lillian turned with a smile, one hand resting on her rounded abdomen. "It never gets old," she replied. "Especially now that it's truly ours, this view, this land, this life we've built." Zack rose and joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands covering hers where they cradled their unborn child. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her hair, "offering you a ride that evening." "Best decision I ever made, accepting it," Lillian countered, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. They stood together watching as the day brightened, the familiar landscape revealing itself anew in the morning light. Later there would be work, cattle to tend, books to sell, preparations to make for the baby's arrival, but for now, this moment of shared appreciation was enough. "I was thinking," Zack said after a comfortable silence, "about that spot where I proposed the clearing on the hill. I could start building that cabin we talked about. Be a nice place to take the little one when they are older, teach them to appreciate the view like their mother does." Lillian turned in his arms, touched by his remembrance of a conversation from their courtship. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A special place just for our family." "For our family," Zack echoed, his hand gentle on her belly where their child stirred as if in agreement. As they prepared for the day ahead, Lillian reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this life. A stagecoach breakdown that had seemed a disaster had instead been the beginning of everything good. A cowboy's simple offer, "My horse carries two," had led to a shared destiny neither could have imagined. Sometimes, she thought as Zack kissed her before heading out to begin the morning chores, the most important journeys began with unexpected detours. And sometimes, being left stranded at sundown could be the best thing that ever happened to a person, especially when the right cowboy happened to ride by at exactly the right moment.